This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome everyone to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. My name is Tony Black, back at last from my extended trip to Risa via Casperia Prime for a little bit of extra sun, sea, and, well, let's not talk about that. And with me is my co-host, who has been marvellously in my stead for quite a while now. It's Duncan Barrett. How are you, Duncan? It's nice to speak to you again.
I know, it's good to talk to you. I was getting worried about you, Tony. I wasn't sure whether you'd had some kind of mishap along the way, or maybe been abducted.
I'll be honest. I was grabbed by Section 31, but I can't talk about that. Obviously, it's
of course, yeah.
It's classified. Yeah. It's there would be a specific cigarette smoking person who would probably kill me if I spoke about what happened.
That would be some kind of e-cigarette, presumably.
yeah, the vaping
something that
man
just lights
now,
up.
wouldn't it?
Yeah,
yeah, it would be the vaping man. It just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it?
It doesn't. No.
Well, yeah, it's been a nice vacation, but I'm back now for hopefully a nice run of episodes, and we've got some good ones coming up. And this one, I suppose, it's not just an episode timed for Halloween. We're not going full spooky, but in a way, I suppose we're touching on elements in this episode which very much tap into a spooky subject matter, because we're talking about the X-Files, aren't we, Duncan, today?
We are, yeah. Something that I think it's fair to say you know quite a lot about, and I know a certain amount about, but some of it a few decades out of date, probably.
Yes, just to preface this, we are going to talk about Star Trek as well, guys. Okay, I promise. I haven't hijacked this and made this into my own personal podcast, which, if those of you who don't know, I do a podcast called the X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, which has been going a couple of years now, and is all about the X-Files, which was the 1990s TV series, all about two intrepid FBI agents called Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, which starred David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, which is one of those TV shows like Star Trek that I think everybody has pretty much heard of, haven't they?
I'd say that's a fair bet, pretty much, yeah. I mean, definitely. I mean, I was thinking about this. Funnily enough, I think Zachary and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago when you were away, about the fact that Mulder and Scully became such kind of iconic characters. They almost managed to exist outside of the show that they were in, a bit like Kirk and Spock or something, to the extent that you have in Deep Space Nine, in Trials and Tribulations, you can have these characters who are called Dulmer and Luxley as a kind of Mulder and Scully gag, and they're sort of part of pop culture to that extent. Certainly they were at the time back in the 90s, but they, unlike a lot of shows of that era, they've really persevered and survived, a bit like Star Trek. I mean, they haven't quite made it to 50 years, but, however many... I'm sure you know how many years on we are from when the X-Files started, but there are new ones coming out imminently, right?
Well, next year in January or February, we're not 100% sure when. They're filming them right now, 10 new episodes, and next year is the 25th anniversary. So next September it will be a quarter of a century old. So it's approaching a bit. And there's a lot of conversation as to whether or not next season will be the final season, but then they've been saying that for 15 years. So, you with the X-Files, you never know. You never know. It could still exist in some form, in the future beyond next year. But next year is a signature year for it. And I think the reason that we're doing this, apart from, trying to give my own podcast some, outrageous promotion, is also because there is a sort of connective tissue between these two shows. I think of the 20th century, the late 20th century, certainly when it comes to genre storytelling, I don't think, certainly in American pop culture, there have been two shows bigger in terms of reach and impact and kind of tapping into the zeitgeist of their age as either Star Trek in all its various forms or the X-Files. And what we wanted to do was talk about some of the connective tissue, and various different links between these shows, not just in terms of some of the storytelling and some of the influences and some of the cues that are taken, but also the fact that they do both represent, as I say, various different, elements of the age they were made in, and reflecting a lot of the anxieties, of the period. In the 60s, Star Trek was reflecting a lot of the anxieties post World War II and post the Cold War, during the Cold War and everything like that. And the X-Files, it kind of does similar in a much more darker, I suppose, realistic way, even though it's a show all about investigating the paranormal. But it does it in a different way. And I think what they both do is create a overarching framework and mythology within those shows, which make them last, which mean that they are still around. X-Files has been around 25 years. Star Trek, of course, is 51 now. So, it's they're very durable, and I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to discuss them today.
Yeah. It's crazy. I mean, when you say 25 years, suddenly it makes me think, in Star Trek terms, 25 years was around the time of The Undiscovered Country, I think, wasn't it? Wasn't that the 20? And they had all that kind of 25th anniversary celebrations. I mean, I was... I'm trying to think whether I don't think I was quite in Star Trek then. I more remember the 30th as the big anniversary. But, to think about from the debut of the original series to The Undiscovered Country, that length of time, it's kind of... I don't know, I find that hard to get my head around. Like, in my brain, that seems like a huge decade-spanning era of history, whereas, my memories of watching The X-Files as a kid, to now, it doesn't... I don't know, something doesn't compute there. It's kind of, it's hard to imagine. But I mean, same thing is hard to imagine with Star Trek, to be honest, that, that was the midway point. And, to us who grew up on, Next Gen, DS9, Voyager and so on, that kind of generation of Star Trek fans, I suppose it's one of the things that comes up when we watch Discovery, for example, at the moment, is sort of to recognise how old those shows that we love are. And in some ways it's, especially like with the Next Generation, we've had the remasters and everything looks very crisp and new and perfect. The X-Files as well. I mean, I've been rewatching recently on Amazon, and they have I think they're basically the HD, the sort of HD versions. And again, it looks fantastic. These old 90s shows they don't show their age necessarily when they've been remastered in this way and so on. And also, of course, we've got the kind of benefit of nostalgia. But I suppose it's hard to get your head around as you grow older, that kind of sense of for me, people who'd grown up watching the original series as kids and then were watching the, tail end of the original series movies in the Next Generation, that seemed like a huge period of time. Whereas that's kind of what we're talking about. And I guess that's something that maybe we have to bear in mind in some ways, that this period that we're talking about is the middle of Star Trek and obviously the beginning of the X-Files.
Well, it is equivalent. There is an equivalence in that, there will be people still around now who are, who watch Star Trek, people in their old age who watched Star Trek when they were, or in the late middle age, who watched Star Trek at the very beginning, and they were there in 1991 when The Undiscovered Country premiered. And it was the end of an era. It was literally the end of an era in terms of the fact that was the last movie with the original crew. And then it was the age of the 90s TV shows and then the 90s movies and things like that. And the X-Files is sort of in a similar position now because both David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson are middle-aged. They are very much coming towards the end of playing these two iconic characters. And... especially Gillian Anderson, who has stated publicly that she doesn't intend to necessarily come back as Scully after this latest run. So, and there's the X-Files has become very interesting in the fact, and I suppose you could say the same about original Star Trek, in that the characters outgrew the concept, in the sense of, when it was first created, there was an idea about two agents investigating paranormal events, aliens, monsters, all this kind of thing. But in very short order, because of their chemistry together, because of the the way these characters were written and portrayed, the show became about them to millions of fans as opposed to the actual stories. And when, without going into too much detail, when the X-Files did try and evolve past Mulder and Scully, as it did during its 10-year run originally, nearly 10 years, people didn't want to know. And it was one of the reasons why it was cancelled, because in the end, trying to integrate new agents, new characters, and use the same format was rejected by millions of people because it wasn't Mulder and Scully. So, much like in the old days when Next Generation first premiered and Deep Space Nine, as is to a degree happening with Discovery now, there is always a reticence to accept new people in something you love. And that's why I think the X-Files ultimately will either be rebooted or it will be, there will be a sequel series down the line which may well feature an older Duchovny and older Anderson in, a bit like Han Solo and Princess Leia in the Star Wars films, in much more of a relegated, reduced role with a new generation coming up. I think it has that overarching concept, like Star Trek does, that will mean it continues on. And I think the halfway point, the 25-year point, as we're approaching, is going to be the end of the beginning. I think you summed it up quite well there, really. The end of the beginning for the X-Files.
That's interesting. I mean, I find it hard to... I have to say, I stopped watching the X-Files before they started bringing in those other agents. And I haven't... Although I've been rewatching some of the early seasons recently, I kind of, haven't got to that point yet. I mean, I wonder whether that is a real difference with Star Trek in a sense, in that... Yes, there were all those fans who said, it's not Star Trek if it's not Kirk, Spock and McCoy. But ultimately, they were proved wrong. Whereas from what you're saying, that in the X-Files case, they were proved right, in a sense, in that they tried it and it didn't work. And I certainly find it hard to imagine. I mean, partly I think because so much of Mulder and Scully, in some ways, like Kirk, Spock and McCoy, they have that quality of they're not just... I mean, they are interesting characters as sort of human beings, but they're also quite kind of archetypal. You've got, with the X-Files, you've got this very strong setup right from the beginning of Mulder is the believer and Scully's the skeptic. And so they approach... Every time there's a mystery, they'll approach it from these two different perspectives. He's doing research into the occult and sort of ancient texts on this. And, there are these anecdotal stories about blah. She's doing autopsies and science. And it's basically very much kind of... belief versus science. And one of the great sort of charms of that show, I think, and it does get modulated to some extent because as it goes on, there are some things that she can't quite remain as skeptical as she was at the beginning without it becoming quite ridiculous, because she has seen a certain amount. But I think that idea of presenting these two worldviews, I suppose, as ways of interpreting everything that happens is part of the key to its success, and that has to be embodied in those two characters. And it's something that you also see, I think, in some ways, feeding in a little bit in some of the 90s Star Trek series. I mean, in Deep Space Nine, for example, we quite, and in Voyager as well, we quite often get these situations, if you think about... I don't know, say Bajoran prophecies or something like that. There'll often be a setup where there's two ways of interpreting the same situation through a kind of religious lens or through a kind of secular scientific lens. And really the kind of ideal way of doing that story is to not ultimately decide, one way or the other, in the way that I think, say, sort of previous Star Trek, original series Next Generation would have taken a very kind of... very much taken that line of the kind of rational scientific and rejected the kind of religious interpretation. Whereas as you go forward into Deep Space Nine and to some extent in Voyager as well, you get this idea that these two interpretations can kind of sit side by side, and there's some kind of pleasure in the ambiguity of not resolving that conflict.
Well, I think there's two different connectives really with the X-Files and Star Trek. I think on the one hand there is the fact that plenty of 90s Star Trek, or various points in 90s Star Trek, were influenced by the power of the X-Files at that time. But before that, I think it's fair to say that the X-Files, to some extent, was tapping into elements that Star Trek had either done or was having, if not a direct link, but a certain cue to that. I mean, one of the big things to remember is that both of these shows both share quite unique creators, in the sense that Gene Roddenberry and Chris Carter, who created the X-Files, both are responsible for these two massive pieces of pop culture. They're not just showrunners, and this is the big difference. You get a lot of TV shows out there where you have a showrunner, and it's, you know, it can be a hugely successful show, like, I don't know, something like Supernatural, for instance, or, you know, a show that's been running for 10, 15 years, something that's done really, really well. And it's the kind of show that as a showrunner that's going to have done well and is going to be remembered. But with something like Star Trek and the X-Files, they transcended the mediums they were on. They didn't just evolve into movies. They didn't just evolve into, you know, long-running TV shows. They became part of the lexicon. You know, the phrases that you used in the TV shows became part of modern day culture. You know, in Star Trek, you've got things like live and let die. I'm getting my long-running franchise.
I missed that one.
live long and prosper. Which is, you know, all said a lot of the time. You know, a lot of the you know, phrases just being used. Well, in the X-Files, you've got things like "the truth is out there," you know, which is the slogan that comes up every episode, you know, in the credits. The fact that "trust no one" entered popular culture, you know, and these aren't necessarily things that Mulder and Scully say to each other all the time, but they're sort of taglines of the TV show that became part of how people consider the 90s and how people consider television. And Gene Roddenberry and Chris Carter both created something that evolved beyond them, and they became showrunners who were very much pop culture stewards in many senses, to the point as well that most people who speak about Roddenberry and Carter will not say that they are necessarily the greatest creative forces on their TV shows or on their franchises. For things like The Next Generation, people would point to Michael Piller as being probably the guy who made that show what it was. People would point to Ira Steven Behr as, I know Roddenberry had died by the time of Deep Space Nine, but, you know, people like that. And in the X-Files, people point to people like Vince Gilligan or Frank Spotnitz or Darren Morgan as people who helped make the show the success it was. So I find it really interesting that Roddenberry and Carter both share that level of being showrunners that are bigger in some ways and created something bigger than a simple TV show and a simple concept.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, it's interesting as well that you were saying about like these sort of slogans, almost these kind of things that enter the lexicon. I suppose maybe that is because they tap into something. I mean, particularly with the X-Files, those, you know, the truth is out there and trust no one. I mean, I guess one of the other elements that the X-Files and Star Trek have in common from a kind of 90s perspective is exactly that kind of trust no one attitude, that kind of skepticism, that kind of, you know, that you see in Deep Space Nine, you see with the formation of Section 31, you see, I mean, you know, look at Discovery. Discovery is you know, whether or not Discovery involves Section 31 or not, it's seeped in that kind of uncertainty, mistrust of authority, you know, not knowing quite what's going on. That the kind of atmosphere of it is certainly very much in line with that kind of thing, or you know, in line with the X-Files, where there always seems to be some kind of agenda, and there's people behind the scenes kind of pulling the strings, and you're not quite sure, you know, who to trust or whatever. And I think certainly that seeped into, you know, some of the kind of Deep Space Nine storytelling, you know, even into Enterprise and the JJ verse and so on as well. Couldn't help but be quite influential, I think. And it's interesting. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on why with the X-Files, you know, why that kind of mindset or that kind of approach was so popular at that time, kind of in the early sort of mid-90s, and then waned. And, you know, what is it that's brought it back? I mean, is it just nostalgia, or is there some kind of, you know, did that show capture some kind of zeitgeist that is ripe for retelling in some way, that those kind of concerns have come back to us one way or another?
Well, I definitely think they have. I think there's been a lot written about this, and there's a lot of really interesting theory. I'd point anyone to a book that's just come out by a friend of mine, Darren Mooney, who does a lot of the X-Cast episodes with me. Brilliant writer, and it's called Opening the X-Files, and it goes into a lot of this subject matter really, really interestingly about a lot of the pop culture and historical touchstones for the X-Files. And one of the big, you know, ideas behind why the X-Files maybe tapped into a certain zeitgeist in the 90s was that the Cold War had ended. You know, it's this idea that it was the sort of decade between history, almost, the 90s. There's a more poetic way of putting it, but the idea the Cold War had ended, we'd yet to, unfortunately, encounter 9/11 and the modern-day terrorism. And the 90s sort of sat in that strange bracket in a way that the 60s did as well. And I think that's why it's funny how certain decades sort of tap into a certain, really hit home with a specific zeitgeist. With Star Trek and the 60s was a very intentionally colourful decade on television, in movies, You know, in real life with the hippie movement and, you know, all the kind of stuff that was parodied in things like Austin Powers later on, that you know, counterculture revolutionary idea of creating something that was very much everyone thinking about the prospect of the future and, oh yeah, we're going to achieve something. And Star Trek was all about Roddenberry bringing this idea of trying to look beyond all the horrible stuff that he'd witnessed and we'd seen in the war and all this kind of stuff, and learning from our mistakes and trying to hope for a better future and explore and all this kind of thing. You know, and Star Trek does that in its very sort of 60s kind of way. But then by the time the 90s have come around, you've had things like Watergate, which is a massive influence on Chris Carter. You've had things like the Vietnam. You've had a 70s which has pretty much destroyed the American dream in the minds of their people. Plus the fact the rise of capitalism in the 80s, Reagan, all of this kind of build back into, you know, conspiracy theories that have been around and popularised in B-movies in the 40s and 50s after things like the Roswell crash, which plays a big part of the Into the X-Files. You know, the idea that a UFO in the real world crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, and they covered it up and said it was a weather balloon, and that they've had aliens in secret bases in Area 51 and all these places in America, all this UFO culture and all this UFO lore that built up in the 50s and the 60s and led into all kinds of areas with people claiming they were abducted by aliens and all kinds of stuff that grew around in the 60s and then was popularised back in the 90s when it felt like people were starting to distrust government. People were starting to lose faith. Ironically, during a government where it was a democratic government. You know, it was Bill Clinton's era, and to some extent, the biggest challenge he faced was an indiscretion under his desk, you know, in some respects, you know, and
yeah.
So it's almost like because the world didn't have a quote unquote villain, pop culture sort of found one. And I think one of the reasons that the X-Files really touched a nerve, and he's now touching a nerve again with the fact that we have the rise of the alt-right, we have Trump, we have, you know, all of these anxieties about where we're going, this horrible creeping fear that we're maybe racing towards some kind of dystopia, some kind of Big Brother, enormously terrifying surveilled future where everything we do is coded, recorded and, you know, quantified, which is exactly what the X-Files talks about. The idea that this maybe is happening now, even more so, is why I think the show is back and why it had record viewing figures like a year and a half ago when it came out.
It's interesting. I mean, when you talk about, I mean, I think there's a kind of one thing that the X-Files certainly has in common with some of that 90s Star Trek, I mean, particularly, to be honest, Voyager as much as Deep Space Nine, or perhaps even more so, is this kind of preoccupation with the Second World War, a certain kind of reading of the Second World War, not the kind of heroism of the Second World War, not the kind of saving the world of the Second World War, but the kind of more uncomfortable elements of it. And, you know, the X-Files seems to be sort of obsessed with this idea of a kind of a sort of guilty conscience almost being kind of handed down, and these kind of, there's all these older characters. I mean, it's kind of interesting. You were saying, you know, Mulder and Scully being middle-aged now or whatever, and, you know, the extent to which that's changed. But in the 90s, you know, they're the kind of younger characters, they're the sort of younger generation finding out about these kind of indiscretions of the older generation, you know, around the time of the war. And the Cold War as well, I suppose. But, and in Voyager, you see, you know, we talk, I mean, our very first episode, we talked about Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer's a character who crops up, you know, is mentioned in various X-Files episodes. And is, you know, there's a kind of, a sort of touchstone there, I think. There's Joseph Mengele. I mean, you know, we might do an episode at some point about the Voyager episode Nothing Human, which is basically a version of this real question of kind of the ethics of the not so much the previous generation, but it's so tied into that kind of World War II period. And you get that in the X-Files, you know, relentlessly with this idea. You know, there's this episodes about Operation Paperclip, bringing in German scientists and getting them to work in America. There's the Japanese experiments. There's a two-parter about that as well, isn't there? And, you know, and they were, again, very much in that kind of Mengele mould of kind of experimenting on, you know, living subjects, doing horrific things. And just this whole, you know, even aside from that kind of historical element, there's all this stuff about, you know, combining human and alien DNA and performing weird experiments on people and kind of eugenics and genetics and, you know, cloning or other kind of sort of non-biologically natural forms of reproduction, if you know what I mean. Like all that kind of stuff. That it just seems to be sort of obsessed with those issues. And I think a lot of those things are also things that come up, you know, in Star Trek and that seem to be very much of that time somehow, and sort of concerns of that time. I don't know if it's partly to do with, you know, in the 90s, I mean, say in 1995 was the 50th anniversary, the end of the Second World War, so, you know, maybe there's a kind of preoccupation to do with that. Actually, I think my understanding is that Joseph Mengele did not discover anything that is particularly useful from a medical point of view, but I think some of those Japanese experiments possibly did, and actually some of those kind of moral areas, you know, maybe have a little bit more of a tie to that.
Yeah, the X-Files is all about that, really. It is all about sins of the fathers, you know, and that kind of fear of repeating history, which so many TV shows that have complex mythologies, which is something that fascinates me, and I intend to write more about, really. The idea that so many shows, it's about the fear of repeating history, about cycles, about, you know, mistakes being made, about the spectre of the past not being able to be quite escaped. And it's really interesting when you think about the fact that in the real world, you know, because the X-Files takes a cue from a lot of the real world stuff. You know, you mentioned things like Operation Paperclip. You know, these things were real. You know, they did actually bring over Axis scientists to help win the space race. You know, this is documented fact that they've quite often apologised for since. You know, and this was happening in the age Star Trek was being made. You know, this was the run up to 1969. You know, Apollo moon landings and things like that. These people were in the States doing this kind of scientific work at the time that Gene Roddenberry was making a show that was all about humans, united humans, going out there and, you know, and discovering new worlds. So there's this real sort of American layer of guilt rippling underneath, you know, everything, society, in that sense that there's something that needs to be apologised for, and that comes up quite key in the episodes about Japanese scientists in the third season. The idea that the president apologised for secret tests, and Mulder says at one point, he says, "I don't care about the lies." You know, he says, I want an apology for the truth. And that's a great line, and it's the last line in the episode, and it just sums everything up, really, in that it is about guilt, and it is about that fear of repeating history, and the fact that the crimes of these old men and are things that will, and the X-Files is one of those shows that has no justice. You know, these people are never really going to be brought to account because it was all done so secretly. It was all done so under the radar. It was all, you know, so covert. And that's why it is interesting when these things start to creep into 90s Star Trek. You know, things, as we mentioned, Section 31, which is an idea, I imagine, that would have had Roddenberry spinning in his already quite, you know, propulsive grave, given a lot of all the things that came after he died that he would have no doubt disagreed with, you know, even beyond, you know, Roddenberry's box and abandoning Roddenberry's box. But I'm sure he would have had deep issues with almost everything in Deep Space Nine. So when Section 31 comes along, and there's been this essentially a, you know, covert, you know, dark espionage unit at the very heart of the Federation forever. That's not a Roddenberry idea. That's a Chris Carter one.
It is, absolutely. And I mean, I had a bit of a problem with Section 31 for a long time, to be honest. I mean, when I watched Deep Space Nine in its first run, I didn't have a problem with the other sort of darker aspects of that series. Didn't have a problem with the war stuff or so on. I did have a bit of a problem with Section 31 because I did feel like it was a bit of a... It was very much not Star Trek, and I found it hard to believe that this organisation had been kind of hiding away all those years. But it is very much that same... It's interesting, you know, thinking about the cigarette smoking man, it's very much the same attitude. It's basically this idea of, you know, we know better than you do what's best for you, and we're going to kind of secretly manipulate things so that you can go on believing your kind of reassuring fantasies about, you know, in Star Trek's case, living in a kind of egalitarian utopia, in the X-Files case, kind of living in a modern 20th century democracy. But actually, we're the ones with the courage to do the right thing. I mean, you see this in the X-Files a lot. These men who are... they're not doing it for personal gain. You know, they've sacrificed they're kind of villains in a sense, have sacrificed a lot for something that they really believe in. They really believe that they're kind of, you know, they're doing the right thing, that these people are kind of like children, almost like fools who kind of have to have the tough decisions made for them in a sense because of that whole thing of guilt, because they won't be able to shoulder the guilt of kind of making the necessary decisions. That's the kind of, and that's very much what you get from Section 31 is this kind of attitude of kind of superiority of like, well, yeah, you might have a problem with this morally, but I'm the one who's going to get the job done. We're the ones who are going to save the day. And I mean, one of my kind of reservations about it is I do think in Star Trek that it often, as much as they're seen as antagonists and kind of villainous and problematic, there is often a sort of question around, well, they are effective to a certain extent. Do you know what I mean? And I don't know. I think I can understand. I'm not as wild about Section 31 as a lot of people are. I think a lot of people think, oh, Section 31's really cool. I mean, like, they decided to bring them into Enterprise. They decided to bring them into JJ-verse, etc. A lot of people, I think, would like Discovery to be a Section 31 ship, whatever that means. I mean, to me, that's a bit of a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But it just like, I don't think there's anything cool about that. I don't really mind it as a storytelling thing. I quite liked the sort of Bashir going undercover element of it and that sort of thing. But it worries me slightly that, this is going to sound very sort of po-faced and like I'm sitting here in Roddenberry's box, but there's something about the kind of relish for it that I find slightly alarming. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And actually in Discovery, it's interesting. I think about the black badges. I mean, we don't know what the answer is with the black badges or what's going on, but it's that kind of. We talked about it. I suppose it's connected to, we did that episode on the Nazis and so on, and I was talking a bit about Nazi uniforms and how there's this kind of fetishization of that kind of evil style. And I think with, Section 31, they're all in black leather and so on. There's something of the same kind of aesthetic and the same kind of idea of there's something cool about them. I prefer to be honest, I prefer the X-Files version where, cigarette smoking man he's very powerful, but he's a bit of he's quite a tragic character in some ways. There's that episode where he's trying to write his novel and everything, and he's, and he's obviously got this debilitating smoking habit and so on. He's not a guy with much of a life or much of. There's something tragic about that.
There is, and if there's a connective between the Smoking Man and Star Trek, it's absolutely Dukat, because they are essentially very similar in that. It's that idea of a guy who is the villain, but he does consider himself the hero. He considers himself doing things for a greater good, for a bigger purpose. He does have family members who he's trying to protect and look out for. He's got this twisted idea of who he is and what he's doing. In the Smoking Man's case, it's that he's attempting to ally himself with an all-powerful. The suggestion is divine, godlike alien species that are going to colonize and destroy the Earth and wipe out humanity. But he's going to do it, and he's going to save himself and his family and certain amounts of people. And that's kind of at the heart of the X-Files mythology. And I think the difference between that and Section 31 is that Section 31 is reflective of an age where I don't think people, certainly the writers of Deep Space Nine, I don't think they quite believed that the Federation and that utopian world could exist. In the 60s, I think there was a lot more optimism that we could have got there, that we'd had these terrible wars, all these people had died, and that maybe we were going to learn from our mistakes, and maybe we could shoot for something a bit more optimistic. And then all these things I talked about earlier came, and all these really destructive elements like Nixon's resignation, this complete breakdown of belief in the system. So I think by the time you get to the 90s, and you get to episodes like Inquisition, you have the writers struggling with the idea that you could have a utopian system like the future Federation world exist without something like Section 31. Because, in Inquisition, he says it, doesn't he? Bashir, Odo says, well, I'm surprised this hasn't happened before. I'm surprised you don't know about this, because the Romulans have got the Tal Shiar and the Cardassians had the Obsidian Order. What do you expect? You're a massive organisation. The only way to survive in a world where you do have people out to assassinate, you do have terrorist plots, you do have, alien races trying to destroy you, is to have a unit that can do the dirty work, because the dirty work is going to get done. And that's what I think has crept into Star Trek over the last, since the 90s, definitely, and since the influence of things like the X-Files, this idea that Roddenberry's idea of a utopia just isn't viable. And that's why you have things like Section 31, you have characters like Admiral Marcus, in Star Trek Into Darkness. You have characters like Admiral Dougherty in Insurrection, who's another example of sort of a kind of corrupt internal Federation influence who believes he's doing something for the greater good, but in fact he's conspiring and plotting against the very ideals of the Federation. And that's why Picard makes a point and stands up and says, I'm going to protect the Baku, because this is not what we are. And that's why Bashir says, well, surely this goes against, you know, the very principles of aren't we better than this? Aren't we striving for something better? And I think a lot of the writers are like, I don't know if we are. I really don't know if we ever can be. And that's, I think, where this anxietal factor has crept into Star Trek.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, I suppose you're right. It's there in, you know, say in The Pale Moonlight, that kind of, you know, the idea that someone might be pushed to do something that they're morally don't agree with. I mean, well, you know, look at Discovery. I mean, you talk about those admirals. I mean, first of all, we've got Captain Lorca, who's very much in that kind of mould. I mean, you know, seems to, obviously we don't really know at this stage exactly where that's going, but seems to be, at the very least, even as he may be partly a sympathetic character, he's quite a dangerous character because he's not playing by the rules. But even in the first episode, you know, we had Michael Burnham, the whole event that kicked off the whole thing, very much taking, you know, doing what Section 31 would have done, essentially, isn't she? Do you know what I mean? She's making that decision, and quite an extraordinary kicking off point for that character in some ways, not doing the Starfleet thing, not doing what we expect. You know, her captain is playing by the rule book that we're kind of familiar with, and she's literally pretty much the first thing that we see her do is chuck that out the window and do what Sloane or you know, or one of these kind of characters would have them do, doing the thing that is not really morally acceptable, but is a kind of, you know, a calculation of that the ends are going to justify the means, doing something that is kind of wrong in the short term for a greater gain. And to some extent that is a dilemma that's kind of run through Star Trek for a long time, but it is also that idea of kind of moral compromise, I suppose, that we see with Sisko, we see with Archer, certainly in Enterprise, you know, the kind of trauma that he goes through having compromised his own morals and so on. And we're seeing again, I guess, with Michael Burnham in some ways of, you know, having this sense of guilt. And I mean, in some ways in Discovery so far, I think it's not really, you know, this whole thing of her being, I mean, yes, she, you know, she did commit mutiny and so on, but people are representing it as if she's solely responsible for this war that would otherwise not have happened. And that doesn't seem to me like a very accurate description of what we've seen on screen. But at the same time, it does tie into this idea of this kind of guilt associated with her actions, and exactly that kind of idea of, you know, if you overstep the mark, are you going to have to kind of live with that? What Sisko says in The Pale Moonlight, I think I can live with it. And the open question of that episode is kind of, can he or not? Because, you know, it's in that performance, it's in the way it's written. It's kind of, yeah, he's saying he can, but at the same time, we don't really believe him. You know?
And I think what Discovery seems to be doing, you know, and as we record this, they're about 6 episodes in. I haven't actually seen the 6th episode yet. But I think what Discovery's doing is, obviously, you know, in the vein of typical Star Trek, it's taking the allegory of an age where people are, you know, the Klingons have kind of been reconceptualized as sort of, you know, zealots in the form of, you know, considering ISIS and all of these kind of things to reflect the kind of times, really. But I think what Discovery is trying to do is create a Starfleet and create a point in the Star Trek timeline where that level of idealism that was in Enterprise has kind of lost a bit of the shine, and they've reached a point where, based on things that, you know, kind of like Archer and that lot went through, you know, the Xindi, and then you would have had the Romulan Wars after that, which we haven't actually seen on screen, sadly. But you've had a lot of things happen since the launch of the NX-01, and that you know, original adventure that I think have kind of made them get to a point, Starfleet, where it's a little bit more complicated. It's a bit greyer. They're willing to maybe go to darker places and do darker things, which could explain why the Discovery exists in the first place and the quite shady mission they seem to be on. And I think what I hope in a way from Discovery, and where I think it will potentially sort of fit the time that it's been made in, is that it could end up getting to a point by the end where it starts to make us believe the world that the original series existed in could exist. And that they reach a little bit more of a point of hope, having come through the Klingon conflict, having come through this quite morally questionable idea, you know, that Lorca and these admirals that he's dealing with are saying, do what it takes. Do whatever it takes to win this war, which doesn't feel like a Starfleet maxim. It feels like the kind of thing they started to do a little bit in the Dominion War when things got a bit desperate, but it never felt like it went that far. You know, with Sisko, he compromised his ethics and everything in The Pale Moonlight, but it was done very covertly. I don't ever remember people like Admiral Ross turning around to him and saying, you know, go and effectively be a rogue guy with your own ship, in the same way as Lorca seems to be.
Lorca's been given quite a kind of long leash, I think. Although, I mean, in the 6th episode, there's this kind of, it seems like they're kind of trying to rein him in a bit. But you're right, definitely. And Sisko could only do that because of his kind of shady contacts. Do you know what I mean? Because he's got people like Garak and Quark around who can, can do that kind of very un-Starfleety stuff. He can, because he's in Deep Space Nine, he's not on a Federation starship. He can get that stuff done. He wouldn't have been able to do that on the Enterprise, even if he'd wanted to. He wouldn't have had the kind of the resources, in a sense, the kind of underworld connections that are needed for that kind of thing. But yeah, I think you're right, definitely. I mean, it's sort of an interesting question in Discovery, because I think we haven't seen enough of the higher level. We've seen a little bit of these kind of conversations with these admirals and so on, and the 6th episode that we've just had broadcast this week is certainly interesting in that respect, because a lot of it is concerned with this question of whether he's fit to command the ship, basically, whether he's to the extent to which he's not following orders, he's kind of making his own decisions, he's kind of running his own, very much going off on his own thing, and feeling like he knows what's best and not doing what he's told. But I don't know, it's hard, it's always hard to say. I think one of the things is because the level of the sort of admirals and the command and so on is always a little bit obscure. You have like an admiral who turns up, and if you have, say, an insurrection, the admiral is a badmiral, is a kind of dodgy one. You're never quite sure how many of them are dodgy. Is the whole sort of setup of Starfleet Command corrupt? We don't generally think it is. It seems like there are kind of one or two bad ones in there. In the Undiscovered Country, we had Admiral Cartwright, didn't we? Who turns out to be, kind of duplicitous. But they're not.
They seem to turn a blind eye.
They're not institutionally corrupt. Maybe they do. I don't know.
It's things like when at the end of Inquisition, when they say, "What did Starfleet say about Section 31?" He says, "Well, they didn't deny it, but." They didn't confirm it, but they didn't really deny it either. They just said, we'll look into it, which means they know full well. That would be the same kind of response you would get from a government department in the X-Files when Mulder tries to make an inquiry about a crash site or a UFO thing. He'd just get a reply saying, we'll look into it, or, that kind of institutionalised, don't worry about it, And there is that little element with Starfleet to a degree that they do sacrifice some of these principles, and some of them know they have to do that. And there is that level of chain of command knowledge, which I suppose in a way sort of parallels the kind of dark syndicate level, but on a different manner you get in the X-Files. That sort of level of knowledge that, in order to keep the world ticking over in the way that they want the Federation, they want Starfleet, they want them to believe, they want them to strive for these goals, that certain people maybe have to know and do things that are against the very sort of ethics and morals that the whole thing is built on, and that if you expose that, then down tumbles the house of cards in a way. And I think that's a fascinating idea that Star Trek doesn't always focus on, but it's sort of rippling there in the background in a lot of these stories, and it has been since the 90s, really, especially the late 90s, at the end of Deep Space Nine and in films like Insurrection, onwards into Enterprise, when these darker ideas started to popularise more. Because before then, it wasn't quite as there. Like you said, you mentioned Trials and Tribulations, which was a little bit of an X-Files spoof with the temporal investigators. And then you also had episodes like Little Green Men, which was a lovely little knockabout romp with Quark and Nog and Rom being the Roswell aliens. But it's played purely for comedy. It's extremely light relief. It taps into all the X-Files kind of tropes. The cigar-chomping general in the 40s who goes, oh, it was just a weather balloon, and all these kind of things. But it's done to light effect, much like the original series does with UFO sightings and UFO culture. It does it with Tomorrow is Yesterday, which is a really knockabout episode where they end up getting thrown back to, 1967 or whatever it is, and they take on a US Air Force pilot, and it becomes a bit of a romp in some respects. When if you look beyond it, there is a sort of a darker subtext in the sense that they're actually, throughout that entire episode, they feel like alien abductors. These future humans actually are doing all the different things that aliens would do in the alien mythology lore of abducting human beings. They do experiments on him. They talk about wiping his memory. They talk about the fact he may never be able to go home again. You know, they do all of these things. You've got the devil iconography with Spock and his ears and all this, and it's played for comedy effect, but it is there. And it's only really when you get towards the late 90s when they start to angle in the conspiracy levels to it. And it becomes a bit more of a rippling, sinister idea in Star Trek. Although I suppose that's sort of there as well in The Undiscovered Country. But that feels more like it feels a bit different in that one.
I wonder also whether, thinking about Insurrection, whether one of the things that doesn't work about Insurrection is that I always sort of felt like one of the flaws of Insurrection is this central kind of issue about... is it right or wrong to move the Baku and so on? And Picard makes this impassioned speech. But somehow, I remember sort of thinking at the time of watching it that his speech doesn't quite land the way you'd expect it to. And it's Patrick Stewart and he's great. And it kind of feels almost like that scene is trying to recreate the kind of drama of the scene in First Contact where he gets angry and smashes the ships and so on. It's this kind of one-on-one confrontation. Something about it, and I don't know, I wonder if it is that kind of, whatever it would be, sort of late 90s by that point era, that kind of post-X-Files era, that have we become more cynical by that point? I mean, Deep Space Nine, throughout that period of time, was showing us, sometimes the ends do justify the means. Sometimes you do have to do morally questionable things. Sometimes there's if your survival is at stake or whatever, or, so basically a more kind of morally relative, murky, grey kind of world. And I think one of the things that feels slightly odd about Insurrection is that it's such a kind of classic Roddenberry kind of position, such a kind of classic Star Trek position. It does feel very much like a TNG episode, but also quite a sort of... It feels quite out of date somehow at the time that it comes along. Doesn't feel like it's sort of moved with the times. And I wonder if that is connected to that idea of kind of mistrust and kind of the greyness of all these things, which is certainly something that we see in Star Trek kind of from that period going forward, that it becomes harder somehow to buy into that argument. It's almost as much as we might want to. I feel like that film is quite a difficult one because I want to like it more than I do somehow. There are elements of it that resonate with me, but at the same time, I find that scene surprisingly unpersuasive, given that it's an argument that it's proper Star Trek argument. You've got Patrick Stewart making it, and somehow it doesn't quite convince me.
I think part of the problem with Insurrection generally is elements of the script and elements of the production and the fact that it's a bit of a hodgepodge of a story. But I think maybe it also is the fact that it's sort of on the cusp of changing times. That came out in 98, which was at the zenith really of the X-Files popularity. 1998 was the year that the X-Files movie came out. But it was after that the bubble started to burst, and it's well documented that from that point on, the X-Files was on a steady decline, really, in terms of ratings, for many people in terms of quality. In the middle of the 6th season, they wrapped up the central mythology, and then it sort of drifted for about a year and a half. And then they sort of tried to reinvent the show in the last 2 seasons with mixed results. But even though the season that they do try and reinvent things is a terrific year of television, but it then leads to a pretty poor final year, at which point it was 9/11 had happened. And that is well known as being the point where the X-Files didn't feel relevant anymore because people needed to trust in the government. They felt like they needed to believe that the government was going to help them because this terrifying new, in inverted commas, enemy had just crashed planes into the Twin Towers. And a lot of television reflected the idea that people would rally round a cause. You had it in shows like 24, which was very much about, the bad guys, the foreign bad guys being killed. And in some respects, it reflects it in Enterprise, because even though Enterprise does have Section 31, it does have some murky elements, it does have those shades of grey, there's no suggestion that there is corruption at the heart of what happened with the Xindi. It's very much that the Federation, that Starfleet is fully behind Archer and his mission to go out there and kick some ass and, make these people pay for what they've done. And it is a big metaphor for 9/11. It is wounds, very fresh wounds. So Enterprise operates in a slightly different way in that I don't think you have quite that level of distrust about the system in Enterprise as you do in Deep Space Nine and Insurrection, and whether or not it seeped into Voyager, I don't really know. I don't feel that show really did that kind of stuff. But I think the times had started to change, really.
Well, I think there's also a sort of question of almost bad taste around these things, isn't there? I mean, there were conspiracy theories after 9/11, there are still today. There are people who think that the whole thing was orchestrated by the US government or whatever. Exactly the kind of ideas that come into the X-Files. But I suppose we see this sometimes, sometimes we see this with these, mass shooting incidents or so on, that people will start questioning things. People will start saying that the victims aren't genuine, that they're actors or whatever. And, aside from how improbable that might seem, there's also an element of it seems tasteless and kind of crass to make those suggestions when, thousands of people have just been killed or whatever. And so I think in the kind of post 9/11 period, the people who were saying that, most people would react, understandably, with a great deal of hostility towards those kind of claims, because it's not just that they're unpatriotic, they kind of seem disrespectful almost. And you get that weirdly in the X-Files. I mean, I was quite struck by, in one of your early episodes from the X-Cast, you were talking about the episode Space, which is about, is set at NASA basically. And along with various other, it's this, I don't need to tell you what a stupid episode it is, but
it's terrible.
It has this weird kind of alien thing that's been messing with NASA and so on. But one of the kind of throwaway lines is that they imply that this alien thing caused the destruction of the Challenger. And you were saying, I think when you were discussing that episode, that sort of felt like it was a bit in bad taste. And I mean, you mentioned Chris Carter in the X-Files does often drop in kind of real world things to kind of tie the show into reality. But at the same time, when you're writing a kind of fantastical show, and in the X-Files, as dark and dramatic as it can be, it's also frequently pretty out there and mad and slightly ridiculous. It's part of its charm. There is an element of bad taste about that. If you're talking about a real thing that's happened that has had awful consequences for people, if you say, oh yeah, actually it was caused by aliens or whatever, there is something slightly disrespectful about that, I think, to those people who've died. Do you know what I mean? And I think maybe that ties into, it's not just that in the wake of 9/11 there was a sort of need to believe in something or whatever, or this kind of gung-ho attitude, which you certainly see in Enterprise, but also that somehow the very idea of mistrusting those in charge at that point becomes more dangerous or more kind of offensive or more kind of unbearable somehow. It's just about possible to cope with the idea that some other group of people from some other country have come and killed all these people in this horrific sort of depraved act. The idea that someone might have made a calculation in the government that it was worth doing that for some, whatever the spurious reason is or whatever. But, at the episode of the X-Files I was just watching, there's this a plane is brought down, so however many hundred people are killed, and Mulder is sort of saying that he thinks that the government or whoever have brought it down because they had to, one person on that plane had to not be allowed to make it off the plane, and therefore they were willing to kill several hundred civilians in order to do that. I mean, it's that kind of thinking that is kind of abhorrent, rightly, and I think when it ties into a real world event, it's very uncomfortable to go there as a piece of entertainment, I suppose. And I wonder if that kind of slightly ties into some of those anxieties and what you need to believe in a very basic level of trust. Okay, so yes, Bill Clinton might have been, getting up to no good beneath the desk or whatever, but you kind of need to believe that he wasn't making those kind of judgments. He wasn't Section 31. He might be a bit of a flawed man in other ways, but he's not, that level of kind of morally relative / evil. That
he wasn't actively plotting against you in some respects,
Exactly.
And they'd had that with Nixon. They'd felt like they'd had that with Nixon, with a president who was impeached. And that's why a lot of people feel that about Trump now. I mean, apart from the fact he's a very, I'm putting this politely because we're on air, but he's a very difficult individual to like. There is a lot of suggestions that he's essentially not working in the best interests of the people, and his government aren't working in the best interests of the people, and a lot of people believe that right now, and it's that existential fear that you cannot trust the upper echelons of government. And I think there was a point where, even with quite a right wing to an extent Republican government with Bush and the Iraq War and all this and all the complexities that came out of that, there was a period, I think, at the tail end of when Star Trek was last on TV and when the X-Files was off air, interestingly enough, apart from the second movie, which was 2007, that people did want to believe in their government. They did want to believe in that. And the other tagline of the X-Files is "I want to believe," and I think Mulder has always wanted to believe in aliens. Scully has always, to an extent, wanted to believe in belief in a way, and believe in God and believe in these things. But I think people have always wanted to believe that fundamentally they can trust and they can know the truth about what's going on, that they can visualize and they can perceive the world around them. And the X-Files has always been about the idea that what you may perceive isn't what's really going on. There is a level of secret history. There is a level of untold truth rippling underneath. And that's why I think it's back now. And that's why I think in Discovery you've got a very murky, quite shady situation going on with, things that eventually will end up a little bit of, underground Star Trek history. There's no way that spore drive is going to end up being a public knowledge thing by the end of this show. It's too big an idea. That's eventually going to have to be classified and hidden away. Otherwise, it would have been in subsequent. I know it wasn't invented when the previous shows were made, but in terms of continuity, there's no way they can explain that away. So there is going to end up being that level in Discovery, which again is reflective of the age. It's why the X-Files is back. It's why, again, we don't trust what's going on around us. And again, it cycles. It's come back around again. And it seems to, every 20 years or so, it seems to come back around. This cycle of something tapping into a zeitgeist. And I think if anything, that could be why Discovery is very successful. Because if it manages to tell a really interesting story and gets the heart of Star Trek, but if it's also reflective of an age where, we need to work towards believing again in a better future, in the Starfleet future, in the Federation future, then maybe that will be part of its success, in that it will help us believe again.
Well, I mean, talking about Trump, aside from Trump as a person and as a president, there's this whole question hanging over the election of, was this a fair election? What level of meddling was there? There's a foreign power that appears to have been at least attempting to kind of influence that election. I mean, if you, in terms of like trusting authority, trusting the kind of mechanisms of democracy and of control and so on, there's been a massive breakdown of trust in those things over that whole process, I think.
Yeah, and it does go back to that whole idea of fear that democracy has been eroded, that fear that the world we're living in is going to sustain itself. And that every day it seems to be another level of surveillance, another level of, scaremongering, another level of corruption, and it's building and building and building and building again. And I think that's when TV and that's when popular culture and movies can be at their best and most important to people, because that's, if they can highlight that and they can use allegory and storytelling like Star Trek does at its best to make you either be less afraid or make you aware of something, or, tap into that existential fear, I think that's when it can be great. And I think that's what Star Trek and the X-Files ultimately have in common. I think that's what they can do in very different ways, in very different kinds of storytelling styles. They both are able to make you, feel things, make you understand things, make you tap into concepts and ideas that are bigger than their individual shows. And I think that's what they do really well in their different time eras when they exist. Well, so yeah, it's been really fun drawing these parallels between these two shows. If you want more X-Files, guys, then hop over to the Xcast, which is my own podcast, because we're doing something called the Xcast Podwatch right now in the run up to season 11, which will premiere, as I say, in January, February time. We've got a podcast a day for the next 3 months, which is talking 2 episodes of the X-Files a day. There's like 207 episodes of the X-Files. There's loads of episodes. And it's based on from there to here. That was where I got the idea from. And I can't claim it's as much of a workload effort as from there to... I'll tell you what, doing this, Duncan, I don't know how Chris and everybody involved did that. I mean, to do this has been hard enough. I don't know how they managed to do 700-odd episodes over a whole year. It's incredible.
I think... Mike, it might have nearly killed him.
I bet.
I got the impression it was quite an ordeal. But I mean, the X-Files has, it's quite a few of them. It's definitely an undertaking, and it's really impressive. I've been listening to them every day. I'm really enjoying it. And you inspired me, just as From There to Here inspired me to do my sort of complete works Star Trek rewatch. You've inspired me to get back into the X-Files, and I've been ploughing through. I've been trying to get a little bit ahead because I think, keeping up with 2 episodes a day is tricky. But I'm really enjoying it, and I'm really enjoying the shorter takes that we get on them. And there are some familiar voices from Trek FM, and indeed from There to Here over on the X-Files on your Podwatch as well. There's Brandon Shea Matala is over there, and Zach Moore, and you, of course. So it's definitely, I'd say, anyone with an interest in the X-Files. I mean, my interest in the X-Files, I loved the X-Files in the 90s, but I don't know, I obviously tuned out at some point, I think a bit sort of after the time of that first movie. So for me, it's been, quite a nostalgia trip, really going back and watching some of those old episodes again and remembering some of those things that really, I'd sort of forgotten how big a fan I was of that show, for those few years, I guess because it's not something that I sort of took with me into adulthood, if you know what I mean. But it really, it made a massive impact on me, as it did on many people at that time. It was quite unlike anything else that was out there.
Yeah, it really was. And, at that time, it's my, given I do a podcast on it, it's pretty obvious, but it's my favourite TV show. It's my favourite thing in the world, really, and it's always stayed with me.
You can't say that on Trek FM.
Apart from Star Trek, of course. Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, that goes without saying. Come on, but
we won't make you choose. Unlike Sarek, we're not going to. You haven't seen that episode yet. Sorry,
although
we won't make you choose between.
Although, to be fair, it was loves. When I was little, Star Trek was number one. It was only when I got to teenage years and I discovered the X-Files that slightly overtook it. They are almost, and I'm not just saying this, they are genuinely almost on a par, really, in terms of the love of it, which is why I podcast about both of them. But no, it's great that you're following, along with it. It'd be very interesting to see what you make of when you get to the episode you haven't really seen, or you saw very briefly towards the end. I'll be very interested to know what you think about that as we get down there. And we'll be there soon enough, because we're already at the end of season 1 in terms of the Podwatch already. It's only been like 12 days. So, and we've still got a bit of work to do. We're not quite finished with the editing and the recording, but we're close. We're getting there. So it's been a lot of fun. So if you do want a bit more X-Files, do check over there. You can find us at the X_cast on Twitter, on Facebook, and you'll find all the links on there, and we're on iTunes, much like Trek FM is. So if you just type in the Xcast, you'll find us. But for now, the Trek is out there. There's the title.
Very good.
There you go. That's it. And of course, the X-Files and how it links to Star Trek isn't the only thing that we've been talking about this week. So on Trek FM. So let's have a little listen to what else has been going on across the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Literary Treks.
Yeah, I think I made what little hints I gave in previous books about who had done it and why. I left sort of vague, but there were a couple of details that I had to hit because I'd seeded them in earlier novels.
Meta Treks.
Well, Jedsy's just going, geez, Fullerton, just have a little more Jamahar on, would you? Lighten up.
Although they did observe that they weren't sure that would help, so Fullerton must really have been...
He's too far gone.
Yeah, he's too far gone.
The 602 Club.
Yeah, so I actually was always a Netflix binger since Netflix started, and saw it come up in the queue, but had not heard about it previously at all. It was like it suddenly snuck up on me, and I thought about watching it, but it took my sister telling me, "Have you seen this show Stranger Things?" And I said, "No, I haven't given it a chance yet. Why? What do you think?" And she said, "It will blow your mind." And I was like, okay, maybe I should watch it.
Well, and did it blow your mind?
It did.
Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Earl Grey.
Well, as you can probably tell from that opening, we're going to be talking about the origins of Star Trek Discovery in The Next Generation. We have a lot of good stuff.
Philip, wait, I don't think we host this show anymore.
Wait, what?
I think when we spore shifted, we actually ended up in Earl Grey.
This isn't us anymore. I think we're just around. I think we just showed up here because, well, coincidentally, as it may be, this is 200 episodes of Earl Grey.
200 episodes. Oh my goodness.
200 episodes.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM, that's patreon.com/TrekFM, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.